Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee, Children's Library Assistant.
We're gearing up for the summer reading program here at the library. And the theme for this year is fairy tales, mythology, and fantasy. We've already had a brief discussion about it. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is something that all of these three things have in common is that they're all part of a storytelling tradition. And I want to quote from Jim Henson's The Storyteller. When people told their past, it was stories. When people explained their present, it was stories. When people predicted the future, it was stories. The best seat around the fire was always reserved for the storyteller. Because stories have always been an important part of our culture and our lives. In many ways, our lives are stories. Stories provide the fabric that we live our lives by. And fairy tales, fantasy, mythology are all part of the stories that are a part of our shared culture. So, the first subject is fairy tales. We discussed it briefly last time. Fairy tales are separate from mythology and fantasy in general in certain ways. There are certain distinct things about fairy tales, which fit for some of them but not all of them, because it's a huge field. People have been telling stories for thousands of years. Fairy tales in general, they've been passed down from one generation to another as part of an oral tradition. So they exist in many different forms and come from many different countries. They always have some element of magic in them that separates them from tall tales or just general stories that people tell. They're not attached to any one religion. That becomes mythology if a god comes down and does something. They're also usually unmoored in time and space. They tend to begin once upon a time. They all happen in some undefined mythological past, and usually not in a place. You almost never hear a fairy tale starting with, once on Hanover Street in London. Although you could if you wanted to, I guess, but a true fairy tale almost never starts like that. They are usually, but not always, morality tales in which good is rewarded and evil is punished. And originally, a lot of them weren't meant for kids. These are stories that people told each other, not necessarily children. The whole idea of a separate branch of literature or storytelling for children hadn't been fully evolved yet. These stories reach back to at least the Middle Ages, some of them much further back than that. So they often reflect things, the way people viewed the world in the old days, in the very, very old days in previous generations. The first person we know of who gathered fairy tales was Charles Perrault in the 1600s. He was a part of the court of Louis XIV. He was responsible for building a new part of Versailles at the time. And those days, people in the French court loved telling peasant stories that the common folk told each other. Because poor people are just so fascinating, don't you know? And so there are a lot of folk stories from around France that were told and retold in the court. When Perrault was forced into retirement due to political shenanigans, he gathered together a lot of the stories that he'd heard and collected other stories and printed them. Now, in this case, his stories definitely have a moral and are more or less meant for kids, because the title of his first book was literally Tales of the Past with Morals.
Self-explanatory.
You can't get much more on the nose than that. But, although the book is still in print, but no one calls it that, literally no one, because it was subtitled Tales of Mother Goose.
Okay.
And that all anyone calls it is Mother Goose. Mother Goose was apparently a common folk figure or a term that people use that never referred to any specific person.
Okay.
Perrault he was the first person to codify versions of Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Puss in Boots. Now, 100 years after him, the Brothers Grimm would come along in the 1700s and early 1800s. First of all, they were librarians. Yay! So they had a lot of time to research, and they went around gathering folk stories from people and putting them into book form. They were from Germany, or rather they're from the part of country that would eventually become Germany. And they wanted to collect stories that had a distinctly Germanic feel to them. So they would edit them to remove things that they felt weren't German enough. They do the most famous version of Snow White, which is perhaps the most Germanic of all of the old fairy tales. And they also did a popular version of Sleeping Beauty, but they cribbed it heavily from Perrault's version and just re-edited it. And when they put out the first edition, it got very bad reviews. So they went back and rewrote a bunch of their stories for later editions. In fact, every edition of the Brothers Grimm that comes out is always slightly different. So you can find legit versions that are completely different of Brother Grimm's versions of all of these fairy tales. And the stories are broken down into several different categories, like for instance, Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel are definitely stories for children. Those are warning tales telling kids what to do and what not to do. There's a version of Little Red Riding Hood where she actually climbs into bed with the wolf and is immediately eaten. So that is like as obviously a parallel as you can see for avoiding creepy guys. They also had spinning stories. Spinning wheels figure a lot in the Brothers Grimm stories because many of the stories that they gathered came from working women. Spinning was something that all women did unless you were really rich. Spinning was so associated with women that a woman who didn't have a husband was called a spinster because all she could do was spin because she didn't have any kids to take care of. So you get things like Rumpelstiltskin, in which the spinning wheel is so important. Even Sleeping Beauty has a major segment involving a spindle of a spinning wheel. And since these women were all adults, these are all stories they told each other that were of a more adult nature. A lot of the old stories were really violent. Many of them were horribly cruel by anyone's standards. In the earliest versions of Snow White, for instance, it's not her stepmother, it's her actual mother who wants to kill her. But it's okay because in the end, after she finds her prince, her mother is forced to wear red-hot shoes and dance until she dies.
So is that specific to the Brothers Grimm versions?
That is the earliest version, yeah.
Or the original versions that they were derived from, that the brothers took
We'll
from?
never know, since the earlier versions were oral traditions. They were the first ones to write it down.
Oh.
And we can't go back in time and talk to the same sources that they had.
Okay.
So there may have been several other versions that are lost to time that we just haven't heard about yet.
So they were the first to write any down.
Basically, well, Perrault came before them. In the early versions of Cinderella, for example, the stepsisters to fit into the shoe would cut off their toes. Yeah, it's pretty horrible. It didn't work, the prince wasn't fooled, plus having the shoe filled with blood, I think, was also probably a giveaway that the shoe doesn't really fit. But Cinderella is one of those universal stories. There are versions of that story in pretty much every country in the world. There's a version in ancient China that focuses on like the girl having the smallest foot can fit into the slipper.
Okay.
There's a version from ancient Egypt, is the earliest version anyone's ever heard of, in which the heroine is a slave girl who's from a foreign country, and so because she's not Egyptian, all the Egyptian slaves treat her really badly and force her to do all the hard work.
Okay.
But the god Horus, flying across Egypt in the form of the hawk, as he did, saw the injustice of the way she was being treated. So he swooped down while she was bathing and grabbed one of her sandals and flew back and dropped it into the lap of the king. The king who happened to be looking for a bride at this time. So obviously seeing a godly omen, he set out to find who the sandal belonged to, and of course the rest is history. So yeah, different variations of that all have this common theme that destiny will out in the end. If you're a good person, destiny will always bring you to the top.
Okay.
So the Brothers Grimm were gathering Germanic stories because they wanted to do something that would unify and codify the German nature. At that time, Germany didn't actually exist. The people that spoke the German language all lived in one part of Europe, but there was no country called Germany. There were German states, and France controlled half of them at this point anyway, which is part of the reason why they excised a lot of the French elements in all the stories. These are meant to be patriotic German stories for German people to read. In fact, some of their stories were later repurposed by the Nazis, yeah, in ways that the Brothers Grimm, I'm sure, would not have approved of. But the idea that a fairy tale or a folk tale represents a national identity is kind of a powerful concept. It shows the power of story, if nothing else. 100 years after the Brothers Grimm, William Butler Yeats, the famous poet and author, would start telling a lot of Irish fairy tales and Irish folk tales and things like that, and write about Irish mythology in his epic poetry. And he did that for a very specific purpose because Ireland was trying to free itself from the yoke of England at the time. Irish nationalism was a very big thing. And what better way to rally all the Irish people, Catholic and Protestant, together than their shared common heritage, the stories of the Sidhe, the little people, the leprechauns, and things like that. Yeats and his small group of writers who worked with him popularized that whole concept. And so well that we associate leprechauns and fairies and things like that with Ireland to this very day. That's how good they were. Do you think that fairy tales do represent a national culture?
I'm actually, in this moment, trying to think of other cultures where those fairy tales exist.
Part of the problem is when we think fairy tale, we always think of fairy tales that come from Europe. Perrault stories were all French. The Brothers Grimm stories were all German. That's partly because of the bias of the storytellers. They didn't want to collect stories in other parts of the world. Africa, Asia, literally every part of the world has a rich storytelling tradition. But no one was interested in those stories at the time. Those are primitive cultures. No one knew Native Americans existed, so no one cared about their culture in particular. And no one bothered to talk to anyone in Africa or any of the Polynesian islands to get their versions of the stories. So that's all part of a lost history that we just don't know. So, like I said, there's versions of Cinderella in every country. And so saying that it was a French story because Perrault wrote it is not strictly true.
Right.
But whether a fairy tale can reflect a culture is the question.
I think it can. I mean, as you said earlier, when we consider leprechauns and four-leaf clover, we think of Ireland.
But in a way, the Grimm brothers fail because we don't associate their stories with Germany.
True.
So, although Germany did eventually become a nation, and maybe the Brothers Grimm helped with that. Whether it really worked or not is again one of those questions that we'll never know. There's also something that's kind of an addendum to fairy tales. The idea of like legendary heroes, like Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill and people like that. These are tall tales, essentially.
Right.
Most of them aren't like considered full fairy tales because a fairy tale has a narrative to it, beginning, middle, and an end, and a protagonist. And stories about, Paul Bunyan climbing the Grand Canyon by dragging his axe across the ground and things like that. That's a story that's done to explain things, like the Just So stories by Kipling. How the elephant got his trunk, how the rhinoceros got his wrinkly skin. They're not necessarily meant to be real, they're stories that are meant to entertain. And they have elements of folk tales and fairy tale and a lot of mythology in them, but they don't strictly fall into that category. Plus, the stories, because many of them are relatively recent, they've been told so many times already, it's impossible to find any original core. Have you heard of Paul Bunyan, the gigantic lumberjack? Yeah, he has a giant blue ox named Babe. I spent some time in Minnesota when I was a kid, which we considered Paul Bunyan country, although several other states also claim him, so, But there's a folklorist who believes that there were never any actual Paul Bunyan stories. He was actually the mascot of a lumber company. And little short Paul Bunyan bits were put into like a newsletter the company sent out to its clients. And that this is where all the Paul Bunyan stories come from. Which is really sad, because I love Paul Bunyan. But someone coined the term fake lore. Things that aren't really folklore that someone has just made up and said they're old stories. Did cowboys really sit around the fire telling Pecos Bill stories in Texas? Or was that just something that came along like relatively recently? It's hard to say. The most modern interpreter of fairy tales isn't like the Brothers Grimm or Charles Perrault, but Disney. When I say Cinderella and Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, you almost always think of the Disney princesses. It's almost impossible to avoid because they're such a part of American culture. One of the big questions is, do you think Disney's fairy tales are American culture?
Well, that's interesting because we were just saying, can it actually
Yeah.
be specific to a culture? So clearly it can transform
Yeah.
because it has. Do I think of Witch now?
Do you think that Disney represents an actual American culture?
Represents, no. Created, maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the fabric of our lives. Generation after generation has grown up looking at these characters.
Yeah.
And just particularly, originally you had to go to the theater to see a cartoon.
Right.
And then television came along, and Disney held back on a lot of the classic movies and wouldn't put them on television for quite a while. And then eventually, of course, like VHS came along, and then DVD, and then Blu-ray, and now you can watch them on, Disney Plus, and soon you'll be able to download them directly into your brain. I'm certain Disney's working on that. And so generation after generation has grown up with these things as a part of their lives. That defines, the term princess and Disney princess are almost like synonymous with each other.
Right.
A lot of the early Disney cartoons take a lot of flack. I think we discussed this last time, because the heroines are passive rather than active. And Disney, to their credit, is doing a good job of finding new ways to look at female heroes. What makes a hero,
Right.
and what makes a hero a woman. A lot of things that Disney and Pixar are doing. I thought Moana
Yes.
was really fantastic. I love Moana.
Likewise.
Yeah, it's not a traditional story, technically. It's not based on anything, except it's heavily invested in Polynesian mythology. And you learn a lot about another culture by looking at it.
Absolutely.
So in some ways, it does encompass a lot of things that we in America are kind of oblivious to.
Sure.
In China, everyone knew the story of Mulan. But until, Disney did their movie version of it, it was almost completely unknown. And Mulan is one of those stories that probably she was an actual person who really did those things. Probably. I don't think folklorists can actually pin down what year she might have lived.
Right.
But traditionally, women have always dressed as men and gone into battle. It's happened in every war that we have any record of.
I remember seeing articles circulated in regards to Viking
Yeah.
warrior women.
Viking women often didn't have to disguise themselves as men. The Viking culture accepted that women could be warriors too.
Oh, okay.
They were more open about that, probably.
I thought you meant to say that they were just not as feminine.
No, there's a lot about Viking culture that, thanks to its current popularity, things have been fudged over the years. So exactly how Viking culture treated women, we don't know.
Okay.
But I think they were more accepting of warrior women. They had a tradition of that other countries didn't. They had a tradition of Valkyries and so forth. Greek mythology had Amazons, but the purpose of Amazons was always to get beaten by manly men who put them in their place. Yeah. In every Greek myth in which Amazons appear, they always get treated really horribly. Yeah, it's awful. I loved Amazons as a kid. Wonder Woman was my favorite, comic book heroine. But then I realized that when Hercules stole the girdle of Hippolyta, Hippolyta is Wonder Woman's mother. Stealing a woman's girdle was, a way of saying something. So what happened to Hippolyta was really pretty obvious. So
That's unfortunate.
it's very unfortunate. Greek mythology, which we'll get to soon, is full of a lot of unfortunate things. But to a certain extent, fairy tales represent the culture that they come from.
Yeah.
Women's stories are often spinning stories because making thread and making fabric and sewing and things like that was all a woman was expected to do. That was her job. That was her role in life. That was the most important thing. And of course, finding a guy was the most important thing in a woman's life. Everything else was secondary to finding that prince. Or a beast in some cases, depending. And do you think that has had a bad effect on culture?
Of course. Without question. You convey the idea that this is what you should pursue, and it's entirely limited, and oftentimes comes with a significant amount of abuse.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it has not been
Yeah, I've always felt that the Beauty and the Beast story was particularly bad for women. Apart from looking a lot like Stockholm Syndrome,
Right.
it teaches women not to judge by appearances, which in some ways is a good theory. But you also need to judge people by how they act.
Not ignore red flags.
Yeah, and don't ignore red flags. Yeah, there's way too many romance novels, and Twilight springs to mind, in which the heroes are just horrible, horrible people. And women somehow believe that they can change them. Women always believe that they can. And in real life, they never really can, but there's such a romance trope that women can change a man. You just have to see through to the inner him. Yes, in a fairy tale, the guy can look like an animal on the outside, but inside he's really compassionate and gentle. But in real life, if someone acts like a jerk, deep down he usually is a jerk. So the morals of some fairy tales don't work, at least not in the older form. It's funny to watch companies like Disney trying to wrap their storytelling around concepts they really don't want to say to people anymore. When I first heard Disney was filming Beauty and the Beast, I thought, that's going to be a sucky cartoon because it only has 2 characters in the entire story. There's 2 people, and like maybe her father will pop up for a scene or 2. And so they got around that by populating it with magic talking, candlesticks and plates and teapots, because it's Disney.
Of course. It's been very successful.
Yes, they were very successful for a reason, and they haven't really had a bad one in quite a while. Disney definitely got rid of all the sex in fairy tales and most of the violence. The Little Mermaid is inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's story, but they totally changed the ending. In the original ending, she doesn't get the prince.
Ooh.
Yeah, she dies horribly. She dies. Yeah, she can get her legs. She can get what she wants only by killing the prince, and she refuses to do it. She won't. She leaves the prince with another person because there is no sea witch in the original version. She leaves the prince with his new love and then kills herself by diving into the ocean as a human and then drowns. And her father makes her into sea foam, which eternally follows behind ships. So it's an explanation for why ships leave sea foam in their wake. Yeah, would not have been a very successful cartoon.
So I'm entirely unfamiliar with that version.
It's not, well,
Yeah,
it's
I'm devastated a little bit.
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Wow. And so whose version, do we know whose version that was?
Hans Christian Andersen. The story had been around for a while. It exists in several different versions. Hans Christian Andersen wrote the most famous version of Little Mermaid.
And that was it?
Yes. It's a horrible ending. A lot of stories did. Even a lot of his stories did. I believe he lived in Copenhagen, and I could be wrong here. But there's a statue of Little Mermaid in the harbor.
Right.
Yeah. I remember, when he wrote the story. He made it famous. So yeah, the early versions aren't ones that we necessarily want to deal with in today. We also have grown up in a culture where children are expected to be sheltered from bad consequences. So we don't tell children's stories that ever have unhappy endings.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Kind of like the trophy, everyone gets a trophy.
Exactly. You want kids to believe they'll always succeed, while you should always encourage your kids. Learning to deal with failure is something that every kid has to deal with at some point. It's children were originally considered to be tiny adults. They were treated just like adults, except smaller for a long, long time. And so when they developed the idea of children's stories, and then fairy tales and folk tales were adapted to become children's stories, they sucked a lot of the life out of them when they did that,
Right.
by pushing them into a child's eye view of the world.
Yeah.
When you read the manual for writing kids cartoons, for the most part, like Saturday morning cartoons, you always have to have a good guy and a bad guy, and you can never show the bad guy having any sympathy, or the good guy having a dark side to him.
Right.
On the premise that kids can't deal with gray morality. Everything absolutely has to be black and white, and kids' minds will suddenly explode if they believe that people have full personalities, which doesn't equip kids to deal with the real world at all.
Sure. Very true.
So yeah, fairy tales are cool, and we've all grown up with them, and many of us like them a lot. And they're part of a larger tradition of storytelling and of children's stories. And we'll continue on with our next session next week. We will talk more about fantasy and mythology.
Awesome. I'm excited to go
Yes.
discover some more of these original versions.
Yeah, it's all still in print. Brothers Grimm stuff is in public domain. You can get it from Project Gutenberg for nothing. Peralt stuff, same thing. Any good library will have several copies of all these things.
Okay?
I think the original darker ones is harder to find. Because those are some of them are excised by the Brothers Grimm themselves. And that was after they'd already edited it once. They edited it again.
That's interesting and I guess indicative of their experience, what they
Yeah.
were surrounded with.
That's the kind of stories they wanted to tell. That was the kind of Germany they were trying to build, perhaps.
Mm.
Even though their stories are considered incredibly harsh and violent by our standards, they were already toned down.
I wonder if that was strategic in order to present Germany as strong and something to be reckoned with.
That could have been very true.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah, we are definitely out of time now. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week, and take care of yourself. Bye.